There is black radicalism because there is, in fact, social injustice. There is black radicalism because that social injustice has, in the modern times, been very often has very often targeted African and African American people. But we have to understand that that's not the way to understand where the social injustice comes from. In Black Marxism, in the first chapter, I spent a lot of time talking about the Irish. I do that again in Forgeries of Memory and Meaning. I do that for several reasons. One, because in 1980, the American census, for the first time in its history, had asked about ancestry. And it came as a surprise to me that the second greatest ancestry among whites is Irish. And that many of the students I was trying to relate racial matters to had Irish ancestry, and perhaps could make the leap into the imaginary of black people by remembering their own histories, right? Remembering that in the 1640s, the Lord Justices declared that Irish women should be killed in Ireland because they were the basis of the rebellion. That Edmund Spencer, 50 years earlier, had put out a plan for the conquest of Ireland by saying, you start in the north, you march to the south, and you kill everything you come across. That the Irish understood, or should understand, something about oppression and something about racialism. Now, you and I know that you can tell very little from English complexion and Irish complexion. And yet they created a racial division between those two peoples. Very clearly similar to what was happening in Korea, which according to Orlando Patterson has the longest surviving system of slavery in human history, over 1,000 years. And I said to some of my Korean students, how could you tell the difference between a slave and a free person in Korea? And they looked at me like I was an idiot. You tell by which hand they wrap their clothing with. Right hand wrap, left hand wrap. All right? They could not tell phenotypically a slave from a free person except for the way they dressed and other similarly subtle indicators. So, one of the things I wanted to say about particularly those two books, Black Marxism and Forgeries, that we had to deconstruct radicalism from its racialist and racist moorings. Marx didn't understand that much, and as a consequence, he left gaping holes in his history of capitalism. I wanted to make the argument that capitalism doesn't produce racialism, but racialism produces the kind of capitalism that we have all experienced. That capitalism emerged 3 or 4 times in world history, that we see markings of it in Aristotle's discussion of profit. We see markings of it everywhere But when it comes to fruition in the 13th and 14th century, maybe slightly earlier, it was coming to fruition in a thoroughly racialized culture. And that thoroughly racialized culture append to capitalism certain kinds of racial imperatives, certain kinds of racial markers, certain kinds of racial instructions. And those instructions sort of got obscured by the powerful imaging of African and non-African people that began to emerge in the 17th century.